chapter 2. So this, when I was making notes in this, it was like I felt like I wanted to highlight everything. So I'm going to try and summarise my notes, because there's 8 pages here, quite a lot. Chapter 2 begins with a reminder that healing from complex PTSD is complex. If we feel like we find some quick fixes, then toxic shame can creep in when those quick fixes don't work. So our recovery is learning how to support ourselves to meet our unmet developmental needs on each level relevant to our personal childhood trauma. And part 2 of the book comes back to everything that's mentioned in this in more detail. So it's a summary. Very welcome to explore the ones that capture your attention, knowing that we'll return to them later on. So the key developmental challenges with CPTSD, we might notice a complete lack of them or a reduced amount, and it varies depending on your trauma response patterns, your childhood abuse, neglect patterns, and any recovery work you've been doing. So the areas of challenge are self-acceptance, a clear sense of identity, self-compassion, self-protection, capacity to draw comfort from relationships, ability to relax, capacity for full self-expression, willpower and motivation, peace of mind, self-care, belief that life is a gift, self-esteem and self-confidence. Recovery work can induce a feeling of, why do I have to do this? Those feelings of resentment are maybe feelings that we should be directing our parents instead of directing them ourselves. And the word developmental arrest kept on coming up, and I was like, I kind of know what that means, but not really. So I went and had a look to see what the description is. Being stuck in an emotional level of development. If, as a child, we did not receive the nurturing we needed to get past a stage of development, we can remain stuck there. And what we need to resolve this is an adult who can help us process our trauma. This adult also needs to demonstrate behaviour appropriate to the next level of development. And there's another book that I've been reading recently that looks at these different stages of development. So maybe we'll come back to that book in future, perhaps, if it's not covered here. So loss of willpower and motivation affects many survivors, and even when you manage to identify a goal, struggling to follow through is a big feature. And it talks about recovery can be with using grief and finding ways to express anger, and healthily expressing anger is linked to willpower. It also talks about faking it till you make it, until there's enough recovery progress made. I think that depends on, I really struggle with faking it till you make it. Some survivors have confidence but not self-esteem. And there was a bit about the flight response being a way to utilise that to acquire new skills. But the imposter syndrome counteracts the positive feedback you get from people giving you support for having achieved the things, the skills. Then it went into cognitive healing, looking at ways to make your brain user-friendly, to calm down that inner critic, those destructive thoughts, and finding ways to choose healthier, more accurate ways of referring to yourself, upgrading the stories we tell ourselves about our pain. Understanding how bad parenting caused these loops we're stuck in, and taking the blame off ourselves and redirecting it to our parents in a way that motivates us to reject that influence. And there was a bit about shrinking the inner critic. Now, the super ego develops before the ego, and the super ego is the part that understands the rules and regulations about how to fit in. And if we grow up in a dysfunctional family, our brains get stuck trying to achieve the impossible, trying to fit in, and it never being good enough. So we create this perfectionism, and then even when we're absolute perfectionists, then we're still not shown that love that we feel we are seeking. So we can spiral down into shame and depression and fear, just that not good enough, catastrophizing, seeing danger everywhere. The ego, if our super ego is hypercritical, then that stops the development of a healthy ego. So understanding all of this helps us to begin unpicking the damage. And when decisions are based in fear, they aren't a healthy choice. There was a mention about CBT. CBT doesn't address all the levels of our wounding. It's very limited in addressing emotional issues. Things that help us with the emotional side is things like mindfulness, which is it's also described as observing ego or witnessing self, taking time to be fully aware of your thoughts and feelings, and have more of a choice over responding to them. Emotional healing. If we live in a culture where we're only allowed to express positives, then that can be really bad for us. We need to be able to express the negatives as well. We're in groups where all of you is welcome, all of your emotions are welcome. It's just such a relief for the nervous system. Those who cannot feel their anger or fear in response to abuse are in danger of putting up with it without protest. There was a section about emotional intelligence, and the bits that are standing out for me here is the hypercritical attack. Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. Being abused for being emotional. And being put into timeout for crying. Then there's also being attacked for displaying positive emotions as well, which some people can experience. There's another section about toxic shame, and how that ties in with restricting emotional intelligence, not being able to identify our feelings, and grieving connects us to our full complements of feelings. It's necessary to release and work through the pain over the losses. Grieving these lost parts of ourselves can initiate a rebirth. So let's take the time to talk about all of these things that we didn't have. Verbal ventilation. Speaking feelings in a way that release and resolves emotional distress. I recognise this as a story that I've got, when I get caught up in something, I felt like I'd really tapped into some anger, and I felt like I could create this amazing spoken word poem as soon as I got to pen and paper. But then suddenly it just dissolved. It was like, okay, all right, I've processed all of the anger that my body wants to process right now, and the inspiration for the poem has gone. There's a section on spiritual healing, and some childhood abuse is as a result of spiritual abuse. So this section may not, there may be some triggering about this section. You're very welcome to skip over it. Organised religions are less likely to provide that sense of belonging for CPTSD survivors. It's too reminiscent of dysfunctional families. Solitary spiritual pursuits are more likely. Others find this by being in nature, appreciating music or art, and having a sense of a positive, benign force in the universe and within self. That kind of ties into like 12-step programs as well. The good enough parenting. This, I don't know if any of you are parents, but this brought up parenting my own child stuff in this. Good enough parents provide generous amounts of support, protection and comforting. They guide their children to deal constructively with recurring existential difficulties such as loss, real-world villains, harsh world events, normal disappointments. And then I got to this and was like, they model how disappointments with close people can be repaired. So forgiving our child for normal mistakes, showing that that's possible to do, so yeah, if you're growing up in a good enough family, then that's something that you might experience, but not necessarily in a traumatizing family. Need to find the balance. See and appreciate the good things in life and see the negatives and the unacceptable. So then there's a section on somatic healing. These changes that become ingrained in our bodies. So hypervigilance, shallow breathing, constant adrenalization, armouring or chronic muscle tightness, wear and tear from constant tension, inability to be present, relaxed and grounded, sleep problems, digestive disorders from a tightened digestive tract, physiological damage from food, alcohol, drugs and other self-medication. Also, with physical and sexual abuse, you're less likely to be comforted by physical touch, and with verbal and emotional abuse, you're less likely to be comforted by eye and voice contact. So somatic self-help goes back to the grief work, claiming our ability to cry and express anger. These can release armouring, promote being in the body, improve sleep, decrease hyperarousal, encourage deep breathing. Stretching. That was a sigh from my body. I don't stretch enough. Stretching releases and reduces armouring, and movement therapy. Like my chronic pain is like when I'm stressed, I can feel it in my body. There's more areas of my body that start to go into pain. But then there's some areas of my body that are in pain all the time, and I need to keep stretching them to remind them that they don't need to be in pain. That's from holding on too tightly for too long. Then it goes into CPTSD and somatic therapy. I think we've already anyway. EMDR, somatic experiencing. These need to include inner critic work and grieving losses of childhood work. Sorry, grieving losses of childhood work in order to meet the complex needs, complex PTSD needs. One of the things that's mentioned is Rosen work. I've done that. It was very lovely. There's also the role of medication. it talks about food issues are unfortunately normal in dysfunctional families. Approach this work gradually and with compassion. Food addictions begin pre-verbally. It can be overeating, comfort eating, or restrictive eating. Also, gym addicts can kind of come into this section. Yeah, I've got a bit more scribbles, but I think that's good. There we go.